les presentamos a Ishat Reza.
Buenos días, estoy muy contenta de estar en México. Es mi primera vez aquí. Esta conferencia es muy interesante y me complace aportar una perspectiva internacional a la discusión. Sin embargo, como han pasado 20 años desde mis estudios de español, voy a continuar en inglés. So I'm speaking to you today as a representative of the OECD. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is based in Paris, and it's an international organization made up of 34 countries, including Mexico. And some of you may know that actually our Secretary General is a Mexican citizen, Angel Gurria. The goal of the OECD is to promote policies that will improve the economic and social well-being of citizens. And the work that I lead the OECD's policy work relating to audit and internal control. In my presentation for today, I'm going to be talking about two different ways in which audit institutions can have a bigger impact on good governance. In the first, this relates to the type of work that we do in my area, where we do institutional reviews of audit institutions, specifically of supreme audit institutions. And in the second, there's a horizontal approach that we're taking in an international study, where we're looking at good practices in different countries and how that can contribute towards enhancing good governance. So the first type, these are the institutional reviews. Our latest was a review of the SAI of Chile, and this was launched in April of 2014. It was completed then after a process of a year and a half. And the idea behind these institutional reviews is to provide a benchmarking of sorts by looking at other peer institutions and finding things that are working well within the institution and other things that could use improvement, and providing an international and independent perspective. In the review, what we did for Chile was we looked at how audit assignments can be adjusted to enhance the audit institution's impact on good governance, and also how they can use the knowledge that they gather in the work that they do to deliver additional value to its diverse stakeholders. Now, why did the Chilean SAI ask for this review? They came to the OECD because they wanted to have an independent third-party perspective. So that's the perspective that we can offer, because like an SAI, we also have the value of doing independent analysis and providing independent recommendations based on evidence. The Chilean SAI also wants to take a leading role in their country in terms of rebuilding trust in government. And for many reasons, in different countries, trust in governments has been shattered or has decreased in recent years. The financial crisis of a few years ago, other reasons such as corruption and so on. So in Chile, the SAI wanted to be able to look within itself to see how they can improve with helping to rebuild trust in government through the work that they do. And they also wanted a comprehensive review. They wanted to have us look at the entire institution and not just in specific areas. The process that we undertook with the Chilean SAI was not an easy one for them, but a necessary one according to their Controller General. And the recommendations that came out of the review are obviously very specific to the Chilean situation, but just to give an example of a few of the things that we looked at how they can use their work to add new value to the products that they have, and make a stronger link with whole of government issues, because ultimately a government needs to be coherent in the work that they do in order to manage public resources effectively, efficiently, and economically. It's important to know how the whole of government is performing in different areas. Other examples, we looked at how the Chilean SAI can leverage their stakeholder engagement and make sure that the work that they're doing is relevant to the policy needs of the country. So to conclude, these types of reviews allow an institution to step back and look at how it's working, how it can work better, how it can add more value to the country, and making sure that there is better accountability and also helping with trust. So now moving to the second area that I want to talk about, and this is possibly what's going to be more relevant in your context, is an international study that we're undertaking. It's sponsored by the SAI of Brazil. They asked us to undertake this study not just for themselves, but for contributing to the discussion on good governance and SAIs globally. And this is a multi-year project of 3 years, and it's allowing us to examine the needs and the challenges within governments in certain areas of government activity, and looking at how we can share best practices or good practices that are happening in different countries' audit work. Now, the partners in this study, there are 12 other institutions other than Brazil. Mexico is one of them. The ASF is one of our peer institutions as well, a number of others from 5 continents. And I was happy that there are a number of our peers who were here at this conference: Canada, the US, France, and the Netherlands as well. And the idea with involving certain other audit institutions in this study is to make sure that what we do is relevant to the work that auditors do, and to provide some meaningful guidance to us as the OECD, as an independent institution, in ensuring that we're providing value-added work to the good governance discussion. The project is in 3 phases. We're coming to the end of the first phase. This month, actually, we'll be producing an analytical framework that we've been working on for the past several months. And the idea of the analytical framework is to identify how it is that supreme audit institutions and auditors generally can add greater value and have a bigger impact on good governance. In the second phase, which we're moving into later this summer, we're going to be looking specifically at good practices and case studies from the different peers, but also beyond as well. And the case studies will all be geared towards how can audit institutions support good governance. Now, the results of these first 2 phases are what will be useful to all auditors, because it will be a compilation of good practices in relation to challenges that governments face in performing the services that they're supposed to, in doing the work, providing public services, having their programs, and so on. So the third phase will be specific to Brazil, because of course they're the sponsor of the study, and we'll be doing an in-depth analysis on the Brazilian context in terms of how specifically can their institution help with improving good governance in their country. And of course that can also be applied to other, the frameworks that we're developing can also be applied to other country contexts as well. So the main purpose of the study is to strengthen good governance and sound public management through the work that audit institutions are doing. And it's also an opportunity to provide dialogue, an opportunity for dialogue between audit institutions and the government, and including the executive, the legislature, because at the end of the day, the common goal between all of the different groups is really to work in the public interest. Because as we have better governance, public trust also increases. And so it's important to make sure that as part of being accountable to the public, that we're dialoguing and making sure that we're all working towards the common goal of the public interest. Now, before I proceed, it's probably helpful to describe what we think good governance is. First, what is governance? And in this diagram, we see that the way we're describing it is that governance is using public institutions and the machinery of government to develop policies and programs to deliver services that benefit citizens. And our study specifically looks at different phases and stages of the policy cycle. So there's the formulation stage where policies are being formulated and objectives are being defined. Secondly, implementation, so when programs are developed and how they're actually put into practice. And subsequently, the monitoring and evaluation phase. And this is where it's important to have ongoing monitoring and evaluation of whether the objectives of the policy or the program were actually achieved. And what we're doing is in providing the ideas in the framework and the good practices and so on, it's at each of these phases that we think audit institutions can add value to the executive. So that's what governance is, but good governance is essentially being effective, making sure that the public funds are being used efficiently and that they're being allocated economically. You've heard the 3 E's over and over again, and there's good reason for that. And specifically, we think at the OECD that good governance is what can be seen in a strategic and an open state. So what that means is it's a state that is able to identify and address challenges, both that are internal and external. And it's a state that has institutions that are robust so that they can help with making sure that there is coherent government strategy, that policies are put in place without inefficiencies and redundancies. An open government is one that's transparent and is one that is happy to engage with other non-governmental actors, because at the end of the day, the beneficiaries of government activity are the ones who are not in the government, but they are the public, the citizens, the economy, etc. And so effective processes are also part of a strategic and open state in that you need to have systems and processes in place that allow government to act efficiently, economically, and effectively. In our study, we're looking at 4 areas of government activity because we wanted to look at areas that audit institutions can have the biggest impact. And of course, budgeting is an obvious one. This is a very basic part of what government does. It's the way in which government decides how it is going to be spending the public resources. And it's something that I think auditors are very comfortable with in a sense, but there's more that can be done with respect to budgeting, not just thinking of it in a very traditional way. So that's what this study is looking at as well. Regulatory policy is another area. And the reason for this is because regulatory policy is so pervasive. It's an area where it has a big impact on the government activities, in that regulations can be important tools to implement government policies, but they can also be rather burdensome and excessive sometimes. And that can be a problem for the private sector, it can be a problem for individuals, and so it's important to make sure that you have good regulatory governance within a country. We're also looking at the center of government. Now, these are the institutions that have an overarching role within government, where they have an oversight role, and it's different in every country context. But the idea is center of government institutions are supposed to help with providing coherence in policy making and strategizing, in ensuring that the government departments and agencies are working effectively. And so it's important for us to examine how is it that audit institutions can support the center of government. Also, internal control is another area we're looking at, and this I think you're very familiar with, in that internal control is important to make sure there's effectiveness and efficiency of government operations, that there's reliability of financial reporting and compliance with laws and so on. And so it's a necessary area for us to look at. The main question in the study really is, how can SAI work evolve to have a greater impact on good governance? And so these are the types of audits that you're familiar with: the financial audits, compliance audits, of course performance audits, but also SAIs provide valuable guidance, or can in certain country contexts provide guidance to the executive on how they could be doing things. So it's taking more of a proactive approach. Also, in some cases, SAIs are asked to provide counseling and advice, but this one is a little bit more of a controversial one given the necessity for independence of audit institutions. In terms of the analysis of SAIs, there are different types that can be provided, and there's a maturity spectrum involved here. So in the main area, the oversight, this is the assurance work. This is where performance auditing fits in. You are looking at, again, the 3 E's: the effectiveness, the efficiency, the economy, and whether objectives are being met, etc. But this is just one type, and this can be taken further to provide insight, because through the different types of audits that institutions conduct, one can gain a lot of insight into government activity if it's taken up to a higher level, that you look at it from a more bird's eye perspective, so you can gain further insights into where government is going well, where the risks are, where there's room for improvement. And once you have that insight, it helps with foresight. And foresight is something that governments need to exercise, but audit institutions also play a role in this, because it's important to project ahead. So for example, if in a particular country context you see that demographic trends suggest that in 20 years you're going to have 60% of the population over the age of 65, then that's an important thing to keep in mind in terms of the types of policies and programs that government is coming up with, because if they're not anticipating how exactly they're going to be dealing with an aging population, then that's a problem. And so that's why foresight is important to exercise, and you can get that from looking at whole of government objectives by making sure that you have insight. And the greater the maturity of the analysis, the greater the transparency, the greater the accountability. And so in the framework that we're developing, we're looking at going beyond traditional audits. Traditional audits are obviously important, still have a role, but the shift towards performance auditing is important. And assessing the following things for the 3 E's is one of the areas that we're going to be looking at. So looking at procedures and systems within government, the programs and policies, but also looking at the various actors within the government, so the institutions and so on. And also finding ways in which audit institutions can provide more guidance and information. So what we've come up with is a list of ideas and suggestions for enhanced governance. The thing is, all of these ideas are not going to be implementable in every country context, and certainly not everything can be done within a particular country. But having a lot of options is always a good thing, and being able to pick things that work in the country context is also important. So with that in mind, I'll give you a bit of a sampling of what some of the ideas are that are coming out of the study that we're doing. In the case of budgeting, we've based them on some draft principles of budgetary governance that we have at the OECD. In regulatory policy, similarly, we have some governance ideas that have come to fruition over a number of years. With respect to the center of government, here's really where we're emphasizing on providing a whole of government perspective, because sometimes in governments, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, and that can be a real problem in terms of making sure there's coherence in how government is operating. In terms of internal control, it's important to have good collaboration and cooperation between the external players, so the auditors, the external auditors, and those who are internal in government, and also in making sure that there are good processes and systems in place with respect to internal control. So in budgeting, I won't go through all of these because I think when the framework is available in another month or so, you might want to read it for more detail, but just to highlight a few of them that are more related to performance auditing. So we're talking about the effectiveness of medium-term budgeting, looking at the effectiveness of capital budgeting, also the quality of budget implementation and delivery looks at the processes involved, but also the outcomes are very important. So looking at the performance and the evaluation, making sure that there is value for money. In terms of regulatory policy, this is something that we find is not being done a lot by audit institutions. It is happening in some places, but by and large, this is an area that audit institutions have not had much experience and activity in. And there is a need to have more of a view and oversight on regulatory governance, because as I mentioned before, when it comes to regulations, they can be very burdensome and they can be excessive, and it's important to make sure that they're effective. And so we're going to be looking at specifically how is it that audit institutions can do performance auditing of regulators, for example, or even of regulations, as well as how regulatory policy is governed. And how it's developed. The OECD recommendation on regulatory governance has a number of areas that it makes recommendations in, and these are the ones that are just listed here, and these will provide some ideas of the kinds of things to look for with respect to regulatory policy. In terms of the center of government, as I mentioned, we're really focusing on taking a whole of government approach, because it's important that audit institutions can provide whole of government audits to help the center understand how is it that the government is performing in key areas. It helps the center with their role of making sure there's oversight and that there's coordination in the work that they're doing. And something that audit institutions can do, and we've seen this in certain country contexts, is that they can help with informing the center of government about risks and implementation challenges with respect to different types of programming, and that can help, that can feed into the budgetary process, so that when governments are coming up with their decisions for how they're going to spend their money, that they're putting it in the places where it's going to be the most effective. In terms of internal control, it's really important to have good coordination and collaboration between audit institutions, the external auditors and the internal auditors, and others who are responsible for internal control within government. And another related activity is providing guidance on what constitutes an effective internal control system, because auditors from the outside have a certain perspective. Having done a number of assessments, they can really understand what is it that governments could do better. And so sharing that in a more proactive way can also help with improving governance. Also, audit institutions can have a role in contributing to government's anti-corruption and anti-fraud policies and activities by providing their views on how government can succeed in this area. And also it's important for audit institutions to take that whole of government approach to evaluate internal control by examining the internal control processes at ministerial levels, but also across government, pulling out things that are working well and so on. And this includes making sure that there's a risk-based approach to internal control, and also in looking at internal audit. And an important aspect, too, is to make sure that the oversight mechanisms that government has set up to oversee internal control and internal audit, that these are effective oversight mechanisms. So I've just presented a number of ideas, but not with much detail, because the idea here is that we're giving a framework for how one can look at improving good governance, but there needs to be a more practical side of it too, and this is going to be the next phase, which will be looking at the good practices and specific case studies. And the idea with this is going to be to share it quite broadly. And since Mexico is a peer institution with us, the ASF will be receiving the products of this work, and hopefully they'll be able to disseminate this to a broader audience within Mexico, because hopefully it will be something that will be of use. So that concludes the formal part of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Les suplicamos unos segundos, en un momento más daremos paso a la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Señaló en su presentación que una forma de fortalecer el buen gobierno es mediante la aplicación de las auditorías de desempeño. Al respecto, ¿qué elemento, variable o actor habría que incorporar o consolidar en el sistema de rendición de cuentas para que el buen gobierno sea sostenible en largo plazo?
In your speech, you mentioned that a way of strengthening good governance through the application of performance audit is necessary. In this regard, what element, what variable, or what actor should be integrated or consolidated in order that good governance be sustainable at long term?
Well, performance auditing certainly is a very important part of making sure that there is accountability, because ultimately the point of it is to make sure that whatever funds are being allocated to government activity are essentially going to be effective, and that it's not going to be a waste of public funds. So because performance auditing is important in that respect, to make sure that it's a sustainable activity, it's something that needs to be brought into audit institutions as an everyday kind of activity. And as our colleague from the Netherlands mentioned, it does take time to develop this culture, but that culture needs to become part of the normal discussion and equation. And through that, it's going to be something that can be sustainable in the long run. So I would say that it's really the initial investment that's made to shift towards a culture of performance-based auditing that really is going to be what's most helpful to good governance.
Suplicamos en sus aplausos. Evidentemente solo hemos dado lectura a una pregunta debido ya a cuestiones de tiempo. En este momento se llevará a cabo la entrega del reconocimiento a cargo del licenciado Javier Pérez Salazar, auditor general del órgano de fiscalización superior del Estado de Guanajuato. Hace entrega también del obsequio la contadora pública Elsa Álvarez López, del órgano de fiscalización del Estado de Aguascalientes.
Buenas tardes. Antes que nada quiero sumarme a las felicitaciones, a los reconocimientos que por ahí mis compañeros auditores han expresado por la excelente anfitrionía que hemos tenido del Estado de Puebla y sobre todo de su auditor superior, el doctor David Villanueva. Reconocer desde luego la organización, el alto nivel y la calidad de los expositores. Prueba de ello, acabamos de tener una brillante exposición de parte de la maestra Ishat, y a quien en el marco de este cuarto encuentro de auditores de desempeño voy a darle lectura al reconocimiento. La Auditoría Superior del Estado de Puebla otorga el presente reconocimiento a Ishat Reza por su destacada ponencia en el cuarto Encuentro Nacional de Auditores de Desempeño, realizado los días 5 y 6 de junio del presente año, Puebla, México, 6 de junio de 2014. El doctor David Villanueva Lomelí, Auditor Superior del Estado de Puebla, Contador Público Certificado Juan Manuel Portal Martínez, Auditor Superior de la Federación. Felicitaciones.